Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Sukaja and this is the Bookish Bulletin YouTube channel. If you're new here, a warm welcome to you. Thank you for clicking on this video and deciding to give it a watch. In this video, we will be talking about 10 best memoirs that I have read and loved in the last few years. I have been reading memoirs for quite some time. The reason I read memoirs is because it's more relatable and more palatable for me. Memoir essentially means self-writing, so it's about taking from your experiences, like a portion of your experience, and then talking about that. It's not like from start to finish that a person is going to talk about their lives, but in a memoir they might deal with a certain period of their lives and really look into it and introspect, and it's more reflective in that sense as well. I've read some really interesting memoirs over the last few years and I'm really excited to share that list with you. Also because currently we're all reading non-fiction in the book world because it's non-fiction November. That's a tag and that's something we all religiously follow. So it's halfway through the month and I wanted to give you all some recommendations if you are looking to kind of read some non-fiction before the month ends. So you can definitely pick memoirs because that's what I always do. I always go for the memoirs among all the non-fiction titles. In the course of this video, I'll tell you about some really memorable memoirs. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first book I'm going to recommend to you is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Doughty. This memoir is something unlike any I have read, and it is essentially about death. If you are somebody who is scared to even think about your own impending death, then I would recommend coming to terms with death itself by reading this memoir. I know we're starting off on a slightly morbid tone, but I really think this memoir will do wonders in that it will make you think about the decay of bodies, of human bodies and things like that. And why should you read it? Because if you're finding death something difficult to digest and hard to accept and something you don't want to think about, but you are curious to know what it's like, then you should read this memoir because it's from the perspective of a female undertaker. So her role is to kind of eliminate bodies in the graveyards and watch them essentially combust. She's in charge of that and she's only 23 years old. She's very young. She's just starting out her career and the author decides to take on this unusual work of being a mortician. She goes on to study medieval history and all of that, but this experience working very closely with dead bodies and day in and day out having to experience dead in our society, she comes to a lot of interesting revelations about how society perceives death and what are the inhibitions people have about it and why is the government not prioritizing it, for instance. Now this book is set in the USA and her work essentially deals with this particular cemetery called I think West Wind. I think it's really interesting because a lot of the things that she talks about are universally applicable. And after a point, after having read the step-by-step descriptions of the decomposition of human bodies as described by the author, I think it's safe to say that I felt a little less scared of my own end. As a society, we do celebrate living a lot and we do celebrate birth, but we do not give the same amount of prestige to the dead. At least some cultures and communities do that, but not all of them. I think this book deals with particularly Christianity but also deals with cremation, which is a method that most people in India use when getting rid of their bodies if they're Hindus. I just felt like it was a really interesting exploration and a very unusual topic, but coming from a very authentic source. A real female mortician talks about her experiences working day in and day out with dead bodies. So I highly recommend reading Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. Now, this next memoir that I'm going to talk to you about is really a life-changing memoir and really worth reading. If you're somebody who you find it hard to kind of not take things for granted, the everyday comforts, definitely read I Am by Maggie O'Farrell. Now, Maggie O'Farrell is known for writing books like Hamnet, several other works of fiction. But in this memoir, I Am, which is a reference to Sylvia Plath's Bell Jar, the title of this book is derived from that. In this particular memoir, she is so raw and she talks about her experiences coming very close to death. Maggie O'Farrell is actually a very private person as an author, but she has had to encounter near-death experiences. And in each chapter of this book, it's written as a vignette. So you don't get a proper conclusive chapter, but you get snapshots from her memory of experiences that she's had where she's come in very close proximity to her life ending, right? So right from being on a plane to Hong Kong where the plane suddenly starts plummeting and she's like going at full speed to her death, to another incident where she's with a man and she's only 18 years old. They were talking and then they walked away and it was deserted, and he suddenly takes the binoculars that he was holding and puts a strap around her neck, right? So she's had to encounter a lot of like traumatic things in her life, and it's really hard to believe that one single person has experienced coming close to death 18 times in their lives. But how she channels all of those things and takes strength from having survived those memories, the experiences that she's had, that is what is really amazing about the memoir. Because many of us talk about writing as a way of healing from trauma, and writing as a way to kind of come out of a difficult experience. When we write about it, is kind of like healing. So that's exactly what Maggie O'Farrell does in this book. Each chapter is named after a body part. So the first chapter is neck, and then it talks about like anything happening to that one body part could lead her to eventually die. There's another chapter called liver, and you will not believe when you read this book that it's actually possible for one person to come so close to death so many number of times. I myself found it really hard to believe, but there are people out there who are just susceptible to things. Towards the end of this memoir, she mentions that it's because of a young daughter who's 8 years old. She's got an immune system problem wherein she's always getting hospitalized and she has hundreds of allergies and things like that. So she comes in close contact to death. That's why Maggie O'Farrell decided to write this autobiographical piece wherein she tells her daughter, don't worry, there is a lot of hope for you to still survive and enjoy your life, or despite having to deal with this challenge of constantly coming close to death. So it's a really magnificent piece of writing, I'd say, and it's unlike any of the other memoirs that I have read, and I would highly recommend you to read it. So that's my other recommendation for Nonfiction November. Right, so the next book I want to recommend to you is Jhumpa Lahiri's Whereabouts. When Jhumpa Lahiri wrote this, she wrote this book in Italian, and she has decided to translate it herself from Italian to English. Now, I personally enjoyed this book so much, and I think of all the books with vignettes, I would say this one and the one I enjoyed the most. So it has fragments basically, and that's what I mean when I say vignettes. Snapshots of memory and experiences that she's had. So each chapter is like an essay in some sense, but it has titles like At the Stationery Shop and At the Down and things like that. So she writes about the place without actually telling us what the place is. So it's actually something we have to assume. And I felt while reading that this is set in Italy because there were mentions of piazzas and pizza. So she's essentially in Italy and she's Indian. She's always somebody who writes about identity in her previous works, and that's why I thought this book was even more interesting. Because imagine for a writer of color to take up another language like Italian and then master it to the level where she's writing books in Italian and then translating it herself to English. I think that's another level of mastery altogether. And there are so many writers like R.K. Narayan and others who have attempted writing in English, but they're never the people we first think of when we think of great English writers, right? Like at least in the Western world, they have these notions, and for some reason writers of color get excluded, even though the quality of writing that they are producing in English is worthy of like higher status. So I think it's really interesting that Jhumpa Lahiri decided to do this experiment, and she is still, I think, writing books in Italian, and she has written, I think, up to 3 of them that she's translated into English. That said, she writes about the minutiae of life, the day-to-day details of living by herself. So she's a young woman because the narrator is actually herself, but it's not told in a direct way. Her experiences, her encounters, living in this alien city, but also a city that she has kind of come to understand because of language. So it's a very interesting exploration of how language is not necessary to kind of become part of a place, and at the same time it's also debating whether language is important and a prerequisite for feeling like you belong to a place. So really thought-provoking and at the same time beautiful in terms of imagery and day-to-day life descriptions and imaginings. What are the thoughts that come to her mind as she's leading her life in this foreign city, and also a city that she wants to kind of make as her own adopted city now that she's learned the language and things like that. So I would highly recommend reading Whereabouts. Right, so the next book I'm going to recommend to you is When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. Now, this book is definitely the kind of book that will take your heart and just give it a squeeze. It's like a very heavy memoir and not something you should read if you're not feeling like you're in a good state. Again, this is a kind of book that will help you appreciate your life and take every day as a gift, and really find a meaning in the day-to-day mundane world. Paul Kalanithi is an English major. He studied English literature, mastered in it, studied it at Stanford, got his degree, and then decided he wanted to learn and pursue neurosurgery. And then he studied for 10 years and became a doctor, only to realize at the age of 37 that he has been diagnosed with lung cancer and it's pretty bad. One really profound insight in this book was there's this line I think that says, when I don't have anything, also I don't know how long I'm going to live. But when I know I have cancer, also I don't know how long I have to live. So that's pretty much the same equation, right? So it's really interesting because he has to come to terms with the fact that he's not going to be able to execute his lifelong plan of 40 years that he had. It's basically brilliant to see how Paul Kalanithi comes to terms with his mortality. He takes to writing and he writes about the experience of getting diagnosed and also how unprepared he is. But he also continues to work and dedicate himself to work until I think the last minute. He was really passionate about doing surgery. But at the same time, he also starts his family and all of that. So it's a really heart-wrenching memoir, but at the same time, no one has attempted this kind of writing before. You really feel for him, and then you also learn the lessons that he's trying to give you by writing this memoir. It's one of the most brilliant books out there, I think, in terms of nonfiction and memoirs, and I would highly recommend you read it. This next memoir that I'm going to recommend is truly inspiring. The name of the memoir is Educated and it's by Tara Westover. I read this a few years ago and this book is just brilliant. It chronicles the life of a person who lives in Idaho, with the States. And in Idaho, it's kind of in a rural setting where she lives, and she lives with her big family, brothers and sisters. And her dad is a little different in that he believes in the world's end because all of them belong to this religious faith called Mormonism. So she is not really given a formal education for a really long time. So she doesn't have a very normal childhood at all because half the time her dad is telling her, help me bring things and put it in the bunker because the end of days is coming. All of us need to be prepared and things like that. Her worldview is very small at the start and she's very isolated from the rest of existence. She has no idea what's happening in New York or any other part of the United States because she doesn't have proper access to an education. But later, she goes on to join a university that is for Mormons, and over there, her worldview starts to expand. She starts to learn new things about the world and eventually ends up learning about feminism itself. And that just opens her mind like anything. And she decides to go and confront her family and kind of come out with this news that, she's been oppressed by her own family and how they've prevented her from having access to a decent education. But then what's inspiring is she has to come to terms with the fact that not everybody in her family is going to be pursuing education. She's going to be an outlier. The few people who do go up to pursue a PhD, and she ends up getting a PhD in Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. And her parents kind of renounce her also in the fact that, she's gone and gotten educated and they are very comfortable in their small world and their small mindset. Just to give you an example, I think at one point in the story, her mother gets a brain injury and her parents refuse to go to the hospital and have that checked because they're afraid that, something bad will happen. So that's how backward the mentality is. And her brothers are also abusive to her and her younger sister. So it's kind of environment that is not very conducive for a good education. But what I think is most inspiring about this memoir is the fact that it tells you that you are not your environment and you don't have to be defined by your family. You get to define your own life and you get to take your story wherever it's about to go. And I think it was really empowering in that sense, how she kind of went against the grain and pursued her education. She's among just 3 people in her entire family who have a college degree. Definitely one of the best memoirs that I've ever read. This next memoir is going to resonate with that quote by Carrie Fisher where she says, "Take your broken heart and make it into art." The memoir in question is Jeanette Winterson's "Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal?" And this is a line which is actually said by her mother, who is not her real mother in the book. She's an adopted child. So this mother says that to Jeanette when Jeanette first tells her that she identifies as a lesbian at the age of 16. So her mother is absolutely shattered because her mother has very religious views and she comes from a very conservative household that is very against these kind of things and considered it a sinful lifestyle. Jeanette Winterson's memoir deals with her coming to terms with her identity, her true identity, which further alienates her from her own family And the fact that she is adopted is again something that she has to come to terms with. Her adoptive mother is not the nicest person. She gives Jeanette hell. It gives her a really hard time. Think of the woman in Matilda, the movie, like the headmistress. Think of her. And there are moments where her mother, this adoptive mother, it's kind of funny the way that she's described. This memoir is about how also Jeanette Winterson took refuge in literature as she was coming to terms with her new identity and having to kind of walk away from her adoptive family and find herself again in a world that is not something where she feels she belongs. So she has to deal with a sense of imposter syndrome as well. So this is what the book largely deals with, and I read it this year and I thought it was brilliant, especially if you're in your 30s and you're looking for a book where just to come to terms with life as it is. And it's one of those memoirs that I would really highly recommend. So the next memoir is something I'm really excited to talk to you about because I read it this year, and it is Speak Okinawa by Elizabeth Miki Brina. This is a book about a Japanese girl who is born to a mother who is completely Japanese and a father who is American. Miki Brina is born in the United States. She is not aware about her Japanese heritage and the fact that she is from Okinawa, which is a disputed region in Japan, whether it should be a part of Japan or should not be part of the mainland. There are other powers and other countries trying to get a hold of Okinawa even now. That said, this story is just magnificent because it talks about the importance of forgiving yourself and being kind to yourself. And I think those are the main takeaways that I personally got from this book. Elizabeth Miki Brina has a very difficult relationship with her mom because her mom doesn't speak English and she's always never made an attempt to learn English either. And Miki Brina doesn't speak Japanese, so there's always been a divide between them. And it just brings to mind how large and vast the divide of not knowing your mother tongue can be, and how alienating that experience can be when your own flesh and blood, when your own daughter doesn't speak your language, the language of your own mother, how distancing and alienating that can be for you. There's a lot of conflict. She's the only child and she has to deal with this generation gap and the fact that she has no clue where she actually comes from. She's a teenager, identifies with things like 90210 and the other American concepts like Chuck E. Cheese and all of that. Yeah, later she comes to realize that she is not at all Japanese because she visits her grandmother in Okinawa a few times when she was younger, and then she starts to piece together the history of Okinawa, which we also get in this beautiful memoir. It comes as asides, and it's really, really interesting, and I would highly recommend this very affecting memoir. It's really worth reading, and I think it's one of the best memoirs that I've ever read. The next memoir is going to be something truly inspiring and beautiful. This is Wild by Cheryl Strayed. This is about Cheryl Strayed's real life experience at the brink of having just lost her mother at the age of 22 to cancer, and also she realizes that her marriage has broken down completely. It is time for her to kind of really take stock of life, but she's in a place where she just can't do that. She's considering ending her life as well. And what happens is 4 years later, she decides to do something really challenging and really push the boundaries of her perseverance and test her endurance and her limits by signing up for the Pacific Crest Trail. So she does the hike. It's a really, really long hike of 1,100 kilometers in, I think, California, in the Pacific Crest Trail, or PCT. This is about one woman going against the odds of nature, trying to really push herself out of her comfort zone to get self-growth and to really process the emotions of having lost her mother and being in a marriage that's no longer working for her, and also having to start afresh at the age of 26. This book is really wonderful in the fact that it tells you it's never too late to start again. And it's a story about resilience at the end of the day. She goes through a lot. She gets blisters along the way. She sees a bear along the way, and she is not very prepared for this journey. She hasn't trained very well for it in advance. And it is going to be arduous, and she describes that in detail. But at the end of it, she comes out a totally new person, and this feeling of achievement of having done something very difficult really takes over and gives her what she needs to really take on the next stage of life with a lot of clarity, a lot of sense of purpose, as well as positivity. So it's not just about a hike, it's about being able to surpass challenges by, doing things that are difficult, going into those things head on, and then coming out of it victorious, and then, really starting afresh, even when life feels like, it's not possible to do that. There is still a lot of hope, and this book is a very hopeful memoir in that sense. So I would highly, highly recommend Wild. This next book is something that history lovers as well as graphic novel buffs alike are going to really enjoy. This is Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. Yes, that's right. Marjane has written the book Stationery Shop of Tehran, which is one of my favorite books, which I have spoken about on this channel previously. But today we're going to talk about Persepolis. This book is a graphic memoir and novel that talks about Marjane's life growing up in an oppressive regime. This is set in Iran, and this is during the time of the Iran-Iraq war, internal strife when the Shah was kind of overthrown. This is about her coming of age, essentially, and how she is actually born and brought up in a very progressive household that encourages her education. At the same time, she has to deal with her own identity because she leaves home and then goes to Austria for higher education because of the troubles that are present in Iran. And when she goes to Austria, she gets exposed to a lot of new ideas of Western culture, like also gets involved in a bit of drugs and all of that. So she has to kind of come to terms with that sense of identity as well, which is what this book is about. I think it's really relevant. Some of the themes about people living in oppressive regimes, it's still relevant today. In a lot of senses, it's a feminist memoir, and I would highly, highly recommend reading it. It's just really beautifully told, and I think the illustrations make it even more evocative and make the themes really come alive, because I think when heavy topics are dealt with through illustrations, it's just a lot more effective as a format. The next book I'm going to talk to you about is something that has been quite popular as a title. This is Crying in H Mart by Zauner. Zauner is actually the lead singer of an indie band called Japanese Breakfast that I had the pleasure of watching perform in Lollapalooza last year. But that said, this book is about food, it is about loss, it is about grief and coming to terms with your identity. Zauner is actually Korean American, so she is born and brought up in America, but she's originally Korean and of Korean descent. This is actually a book that talks about her experience of losing her mother to pancreatic cancer, and post that, at the age of 24, Zauner really tries to come to terms with her Korean identity once again, because her mother was the main source of her identity for a really long time, leading up to her starting the band and all of that. But then she really gets caught up in American culture to the extent that she forgets what it really means to be Korean and her cultural roots. So it's about her going back to her roots. And the title of this book, Crying in H Mart, is actually derived from an episode in Michelle's life where she found herself coming to a breakdown in a Korean supermarket because she looked at all the food and remembered that her mom was preparing a lot of yummy things for her growing up using all these ingredients. It's about how food helps us build memories and also is a way to our cultural identities. It's a way to kind of reconnect with that and find out who we really are through food. So definitely, if you're a foodie, you're going to want to go to your nearest Korean mart and buy a bunch of food to eat as you read this book. But at the same time, I think it's a really great exploration of grief. It's very raw, it's very introspective, and it's just really very universal in the way it deals with the subject of loss as well. So I highly recommend reading this book as well. That brings us to the end of the list. I'm really curious to know if there are any memoirs that have turned out to be your favorites or books that you are planning to read in this nonfiction November. I'd love to know and hear from you. Please leave a comment down below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And you can also hit the bell icon to be notified every single time I post a new video. I am going to be coming back soon with more bookish content and thoughts. In the meantime, stay safe, stay sane. Happy reading. Bye.